Okay, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 3 of Dreamforce. I hope everyone's settled in now. This is the second time I've done this talk. The first time was Tuesday morning, and I feel like everyone was still kind of even just figuring out where are we, what's going on. So I'm hoping that by now you've settled in and we're ready to go. I certainly have. I've gotten used to the whole idea of the crowd flow. I figured out how to make my way through things. It's very exciting. Just in time for one more day to go, right? My name is Sarah May. I work here at Salesforce as a software architect in the design systems team. Within the UX group, we have Camp Design right over there if you'd like to learn more about how we do UX at Salesforce. Is there anyone here who's been to more than 5 Dreamforces? Wow, that's awesome. Anyone in your first Dreamforce? Nice. Well, this is my second Dreamforce. I started last year, literally I started on a Wednesday and Dreamforce started on a Monday. And it was pretty overwhelming, I would say, for my first week of work, but it was really kind of cool. I came and hung out and I talked to people about what they did with Salesforce and what they were trying to do with it. And it was great for me because I came to Salesforce really after 19 years of developing software in the startup and consulting spaces. And during that time, I never really interacted much with Salesforce. I knew what CRM meant. I was very proud of that. I walked into day one knowing what CRM stood for. But I didn't know much about what the rest of Salesforce was, what they did, what all the different products and how they work together. And all the different types of people that use it as well. And so I'm here to talk to you today about open source, which is a world that I've been in as a developer for more than 20 years at this point. And I was surprised when I joined the company last year and when I came to Dreamforce that open source really hasn't been a huge part of our public story. We use it a lot internally, but I think when we talk about what we do in public, we don't tend to emphasize it. And when I joined last year, I was coming in as a typical member, I think, of the open source community, in that I didn't know much about Salesforce or what they did. And then when I got here, I discovered that on our side, there's sometimes a lot of folks that work in Salesforce that don't know a ton about open source. And so I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to kind of bring both sides together, because I think there's there's so much good stuff on both sides. So here's what I'm going to cover today. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what open source is, which is a harder question than it sounds like. I'm going to talk about why you should get involved, and then I'm going to talk about how you get started. But I want to start out with a story. So this particular story is about a colleague of mine here at Salesforce, but I've heard this story dozens of times over the last 20 years from all different types of people. I would like you to meet, here we go, Lexis, who's a software engineer on the Trailhead team. She is a real person. She's actually in the audience with us today. She's worked for Salesforce for a while. And she started out not as a software engineer at all, but as one of our amazing customer success folks, which of course is a very different job from writing software. And as a customer success manager, her job was to answer phone calls and emails from customers who were having issues using the product. And Lexis had always worked at tech companies, but never on the engineering side. The programming part, it always seemed a bit inaccessible. But in this customer success manager role, she physically sat near a bunch of engineers, got to know them, and when she mentioned that she might want to try programming, they pointed her at some online resources. And so she started spending a bunch of time, nights and weekends, learning about programming using these online resources. And then one afternoon, the engineer she worked with said, hey, we're going to a meetup about React at Salesforce. Do you want to come with us? React is a popular open source project. It's a JavaScript framework that was originally written by Facebook, is now used fairly widely across the industry. And she'd done some React in some of her solo learning projects, and so she thought she would go to this meetup. So we'll come back to the story in a minute. I want to pause here, though, and explain what those words are that I just used and what they mean. What does it mean when I say React is a popular open source project? What does open source even mean? And this is, as I said, not as easy of a question as it sounds. So I'm going to give you 2 definitions. First, I'm going to give you a very broad definition, which is the one I like. And second, I'm going to give you the more narrow, more focused, and to be honest, more common definition. And then I'm going to kind of give you some context for why you might want to use one or the other. So here's what I think open source is. Open source describes a project built in the open by a distributed team. And so when we're talking about a project, there's 2 key pieces of that, right? That it happens in public, that you can see everything that's happening as the project progresses, and that the team is distributed, meaning most of the interactions happen through text rather than in person. Now this sounds super abstract, right? Like, what kind of projects are we talking about? What does in the open really mean? Why does the team have to be distributed? So let me back up for a moment and say that open source started out as an idea in the software development world. which is why there's me, a software architect, up here telling you about it. And the software design definition is narrower than this one. Open source started out as just software. Now, as you all know, Salesforce really loves software. I still find it pretty funny that one of our mascots is literally like the international symbol for no, plastered across the word that describes what I do. And so, yeah, I think maybe I'll try and get a selfie with the person walking around in that suit this afternoon. We'll see. But open source software got started about 20 years ago-ish, and it was a reaction to the fact that as the software industry got going in the 60s, most companies very closely guarded their source code to their software. They considered the source code to be the fundamental piece of intellectual property that they were creating. But over time, as developers moved between companies, they noticed that there's some code that's not really related to their business that they kept having to rewrite every time they went to a new place. So for example, if you were working at company A that did games and you moved to company B that did spreadsheets and you had a piece of code that set up your workstation, setting up a workstation doesn't really have anything to do with spreadsheets or games. But because the source code as an asset was guarded so closely, you couldn't take the code you'd written at one and use it in another place. And that seemed like a waste of everybody's time, frankly, including the companies. So developers started making little pieces of utility code in their free time, so sort of not on company time, right, and releasing it into the public in various ways. This was before the web was a thing. And so that they could use it when they moved companies. And those were the projects, right? And over time, other developers looking for some kind of similar solution would find it, and maybe they would fix a bug they noticed, or they would add some little feature they wanted. They would send those changes back to the original owner. That's the distributed team part. And so over time, these open source projects got bigger and bigger as more and more people contributed to them, and eventually, even higher level software, like so-called user level software, meaning basically anything that pops up a window, was developed in this way as well. And so these days, 20 years later, on the software side, all kinds of software is open source. So lots of developer tools, as you might imagine, since this is where it came from, but lots of other stuff as well. So for example, Firefox, the web browser, Android, the phone operating system, Raspberry Pi, which is a hardware hacking platform, Scratch, which is used to teach both kids and adults programming, WordPress, which is used by 30% of the websites on the internet, many developer tools like the Git version control system, MySQL database, programming languages like Python, Ruby, and PHP, and there's a lot more as well. So coming back to this broader definition, if we're thinking about it specifically in terms of software, and we want that narrower software definition, there we go. Open source is a software system built in the open with the source code freely available. And the distributed team part just means kind of incorporating outside contributions. And so that's the important part, right? The idea that many eyes on the source code from different locations, different corporate cultures, different backgrounds, different countries even, produces higher quality software. And that's why some people prefer to use open source software rather than so-called closed source or traditional software, something like Photoshop or iOS or Windows, where you get just the runnable software, but you can't see the source code that was used to build it. The theory here, and it mostly holds up in practice, is that no matter how many engineers internally you have looking at your closed source code, there are many more engineers in the outside world who, if they were sufficiently motivated to do so, would be able to find bugs in your software. And so more people looking at your software will find more bugs and raise the quality level of the software overall. That's the theory. Of course, there's drawbacks to releasing your code as open source as well. You need to be really careful about not releasing secrets into your code base like API keys or passwords. You need to have a process for evaluating and incorporating contributions back into your code. It's actually quite a reasonable investment in community management that you have to make. And if you make your money selling runnable software, now this is the traditional argument against it, if you make your money selling runnable software, you may cannibalize some of that revenue as people who can build the software themselves do, rather than buying your version. But the theory there is that you are increasing the community, you're increasing the number of people that can use your software and look at it, and that over time, that will also increase your revenue. And there have been many companies that have been built on the back of that idea. And open source as a concept, the reason that I didn't start out with the software definition, I started out with the more broad one, is that open source as a concept has expanded. So it's not just software anymore. And this is where it gets really exciting for me, because the principles of open source have been adopted by other communities outside of technology. So for example, there's the open data movement, which is where scientists release both, when they write a paper, they release the data and they release the code they use to munge the data so that other scientists find it easier to completely recreate their findings. There's Creative Commons, which is sort of like open source for creative works like photos and writing. Wikipedia actually is founded on this idea that if you have more people observing a set of documents, in this case sort of an encyclopedia, and adding and correcting things that they know, even if it's just little things at a time, over time that will add up to a large body of useful information. So, and even just sort of the general idea of crowdsourcing, this idea that you can take a little bit from a bunch of different people and make something big out of it, is something that really was pioneered in the open source community in the 80s and 90s. And so now you see interesting things like sites like Zooniverse, where scientists post photos of penguin studies, and you help them by figuring out how many penguins are in each picture. And so you're contributing a little bit to some scientists' experiments a little bit at a time. So even though the open source that we're talking about today really are software projects, because if we're working with Salesforce, we're technology workers, those are the projects that are going to help our careers, I want you to think about this broader definition as well, because there's some really exciting things happening here. So let's talk about why you should get involved. When we left off, our hero was on her way to a meetup at Salesforce for React at Salesforce. And I do appreciate that with our national parks team, she provided me with a suitably national park-oriented photo. Here we have an open source project. We have several open source projects here at Salesforce you may be familiar with. One of them is called the Lightning Design System, which is what I work on, which is our toolkit for building visual user interfaces on the web that look like Salesforce. And if you want to know more about that, you can go talk to the folks over at Camp Design. We also have a React version of that design system called, I guess appropriately, Design System React. So she went to this meetup, and one of the talks was by an engineering manager at Salesforce named Bruno, who worked on Design System React. And she emailed him afterwards to get coffee, originally just to kind of figure out what an engineering manager looks for in a developer, because she was thinking about making this transition from customer success to engineering. And so long story short, but we will come back to that story, she ended up getting involved writing some code for Design System React and contributing to the project over time, so that when she was ready to actually make the transition over to developers, she found that having that open source experience was really crucial. Because she was coming at this with no computer science degree, she did not go to a code school, completely self-taught, right? Degree in finance, past experience in customer success. No like official engineering experience. Except she had her work on Design System React, which is being out in the open. Anyone could look at it. And when the time came to make the move, she interviewed both internally and externally to Salesforce. And got several offers and ended up, I guess lucky for Salesforce, taking this job as a software engineer on Team Trailhead. But it was the open source contribution that really accelerated her career and let her shift roles. And that's ultimately what I'm talking about when I'm saying accelerating your career, right? Giving yourself a stronger network, more experience, ultimately more options. So you may be thinking, I'm not an engineer, I'm not sure I really want to be one, and that's totally fine, because open source projects need lots of different skill sets. Even the open source projects that we're talking about that are code-based, like Design System React, need more than just development work. They need testing, they need project management. Basically, anything a software project needs in the commercial world, open source projects also need. Everything down front to marketing, community management. And keep in mind that while it's totally legit to join an open source project to get involved and do something you're already good at, like say you're already a great project manager and you want to contribute some of those skills in a different way, it's also totally legit to get involved and try something that's new to you. Open source projects are often run by volunteers. Certainly many of the contributors are often volunteers. And so they're an opportunity to do something that stretches your abilities and that isn't just a classroom project. So say you're a great project manager, but you also are interested in QA. Like you could get involved, do a little bit of project management, and also do some testing. Or like Lexus, you can join to do development and then find that your customer success skills are actually part of what make you successful in open source. More on that in a bit. So open source projects need many skill sets, but what about you? What do you need? Well, as a high-tech worker, you need a healthy network. And I know everyone tells you this, right? That's your network that gets you jobs, gets you opportunities. You do some Googling. Here's the latest I could find. Typical articles that you'll find, 85% of all open positions are filled by someone through networking versus people filling out forms online and applying, that kind of thing. As an introvert, I think, really there's very few things that strike fear into my heart as much as the word networking. In fact, there's probably only one phrase that I dislike more than networking, and that is networking mixer. Attending events where I am expected to network with people. And it's scary, right? I used to think that this is what I would have to do. I'd have to just go to a lot of networking mixers and have a lot of conversations with people that I didn't really understand. But open source is kind of a cheat code when it comes to building your network. When you work on open source, you get the opportunity to meet and work with people that are outside of the small group you encounter at your jobs that you're working 9 to 5, right? So you need these personal connections, but if you just stick to the people you meet at work, your network isn't going to be broad enough to sustain you. But the nature of open source allows you to form these personal connections and work with people who are not in your role, who are not in your industry, who are not in your company. And so working on open source is a way to start forming this broader network without having to go to networking mixers. So you get to strengthen your network. Projects get to improve their situation and get stuff done that they need done. So it really is kind of a win for both sides. So the question is, why doesn't everyone get involved, right? Well, that's because it's difficult. Getting started is hard. This is the hardest part. And this is always kind of where the rubber meets the road and the hard work happens, right? And Lexis was no exception to that rule. So having found that she was a project that she was interested in, she first needed to pitch the idea to her manager, hey, I should spend 20% of my time, 2 days a week, like shadowing an engineer over here in this other group, and eventually writing some code with them. And that's kind of a hard sell, right? If that kind of thing hadn't been an option, she probably would have had to think about doing this during her free time, which is very difficult for a lot of people to do. And the work itself was not kind of rainbows and unicorns either, right? Like, there are times when she didn't agree with decisions made by the maintainers about what to put into the framework and what to leave out. And so she had several intense discussions with people on GitHub issues about that as she worked on the project. Now, ultimately, though, that openness ended up being a huge asset. So the external folks that she interviewed with when she did so, several of them mentioned that they liked how she dealt with conflict. And they said that because they could literally see how she dealt with conflict. They didn't have to ask her, how would you, right? They could go and look at these GitHub issues and see, oh, this is how she discusses things with people when she doesn't agree. And so Lexis may not have had like sort of the raw coding experience maybe of some of the folks applying for entry-level developer jobs, but she had her unique abilities, such as careful conflict resolution, which is a super important thing to do if you're in customer success. And people recognize this as a huge asset. So an open source project is a chance to show what else you can do besides the kind of stuff that you're looking for. So that said, let's go through the steps that you could take if you want to write your own success story, which probably will look quite different. And the first thing you should do is make an account on GitHub, which is a website where most of the open source world does its work. I know it says built for developers right there, but you will need an account even if you're not intending to do any engineering work. GitHub is oriented around the idea of projects. So each project has its own page, and on that page you can get the source code, access documentation, report a bug, read recent discussions, all that kind of stuff. So once you have a GitHub account, you'll be able to start to see all of these projects. So then your next step, of course, is to find a project that you want to work on. So this is the tyranny of choice right here, right? GitHub hosts hundreds of thousands of different open source projects, and there's so many that it can be really hard to figure out which one, A, is like interesting to you, B, is open to new contributors, C, has something that's in your wheelhouse that you want to work on. And so for many folks, actually finding the project is the biggest barrier to getting involved, is the hardest part. They want to start working on open source in theory, but they don't really know how to get going in practice. So I've put together a couple of strategies for you to try out. The first thing you can do is you can look for projects that are specifically interested in helping newcomers get involved. Projects vary in their openness to helping new people. So there's a website that I really like called First Timers Only, which is literally just it's an aggregator for projects and pieces of work, stories, issues that projects have tagged specifically for people to do their first piece of open source work. So this is a great resource. There's a couple of other things that are similar to this. I find this one tends to have the most useful information. But there are, if you Google for this type, for like, how do I find an open source project to work on, you'll find a couple of these kinds of sites. I like this one the most. The next thing you can try is to look for projects in a particular space or run by a particular organization that you're interested in. So say, for example, you're interested in augmented reality or web development or Node.js, like JavaScript, server-side JavaScript or something like that. You can look specifically for projects that are in that area, or if there's an organization you want to work with. So for example, here's our Each organization on GitHub also has a page. So this is the page for the Salesforce UX GitHub organization. Other organizations also have their page, so Facebook has one, and et cetera, et cetera. So you can come here and you can see there's a list of projects up there, and usually they're ordered by sort of most active. So a lot of times companies will have a lot of open source projects. Certainly Salesforce does, Facebook, all these large companies have a lot of open source. But if you're looking for the ones that are active, you'll want to just look for the ones on the top. So that's one way you can search on GitHub for organizations that you're interested in and see which projects are active on their pages. GitHub actually has some really good help for this kind of thing. I was surprised. This is not something I used to have, so they've definitely put some investment into this recently. They have a bunch of help oriented around helping you find a project that you're interested in. So looking by topic, looking by organization or owner, looking by person that you're interested in working with, and that kind of thing. So this is GitHub actually also has a decent amount of help with this because it's of course in their interest for you to get involved and use their service more. And finally, you can look for projects that are run by people that you like. And this has actually been mostly my strategy, is that I will meet someone at a conference or at a meetup or something, and they'll be like, hey, I work on X. And I'll think, OK, well, that sounds interesting. I want to work with good people. I like this person. I think that they would be interesting to work with. And so really using your network to try and figure out, oh, what projects do the people that I know work on? Do I follow anyone on Twitter that works on interesting projects? Or have I seen a Medium post recently? This is typically how I do it. And of course, in the story that I've been telling you about Lexus, that's kind of how this happened as well, is that she met someone at a meetup, and then that's how everything got connected. But I think that all of these are ways that I've heard about people successfully finding projects to work on. And then you need to figure out then how that project wants you to get in touch. So if you're using something like First Timers Only, often they will give you very specific instructions about, OK, first thing you need to do is go to this page, click on this thing, fill out this form. A lot of times there will be different ways. Open source projects have a huge variety of ways that they will like to communicate. And so oftentimes when you go to the project page in GitHub, it will sometimes list how they like to communicate. There will be a resources section, or there'll be like a contributors document. So look on the project page for that. There's a huge variety, and so it's very difficult for me to be like, okay, all you need is Slack. But there's a lot of different ways that projects want to communicate. I know we all need more Slack rooms, so there's that. And then once you sort of get in contact with that project, and you try and figure out, okay, what kind of stuff do they need help with? What can I offer? The important thing is to remember that when you start contributing, it's really great. People really appreciate small improvements. If you fix a typo in the documentation, or you find a thing where you're like, oh, this step should actually be before that step when I tried to set it up, people really appreciate that sort of change. And so that is a great way to just kind of test the waters and see, like, OK, is this a project I am enjoying interacting with? Does this feel useful to me? Definitely over-communicate with the project, with the folks in the project on whatever channel they want to be communicated with. And keep at it, because a lot of projects, these projects are run by volunteers often. And so as opposed to sort of a company where you would expect when you dropped a question that they would get back to you in a day or two, sometimes I feel like, especially with volunteers, it's like, oh, it might be the weekend or the next week before they really have time to circle back and figure stuff out. And so be patient with people and with projects, because a lot of folks are doing this in sort of their free time. And finally, just remember that this is really about the people. This is about you strengthening your network, working on different projects, working with different people. And really, this is what it's all about, ultimately. And that's all I got for you today. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of Dreamforce. Have a good one.